Mississippi, 1843. The air was thick with humidity and the slow hum of cicadas. Cotton fields stretched to the horizon like a pale ocean, each wave made of labor and blood. To outsiders, this was the pinnacle of Southern success. Vast land, rich harvests, and the illusion of God's blessing. But behind every plantation gate, the truth grew darker than the soil itself. They called it the Cotton Kingdom, a paradise for the wealthy and a living hell for the enslaved. In those years, Mississippi produced more cotton than any place on earth. The rivers carried barges loaded with white fiber, and planters rode through their estates with polished boots and silver canes, basking in pride. Yet the wealth that shimmered under the southern sun was built on bones, black, broken and buried deep. On the outskirts of Claiborne County, hidden behind miles of swamp and willow, stood the Bellamy estate. Locals whispered about it in hushed tones, not out of respect, but fear. It wasn't the size of the mansion that frightened them, though it towered over the land with its white columns and iron balconies. It was the silence that surrounded it. Unlike other plantations filled with the sound of work and life, the Bellamy grounds were unnaturally still. The man who owned it, Jonathan Bellamy, was spoken of as both a genius and a monster. A man who treated his land as an experiment, his workers as subjects, and his family as instruments of his will. But we'll get to him soon enough. For now we stay in the fields, where every dawn began with a scream. The overseer's whips cracked before the sunrise. Children as young as 10 dragged baskets larger than their bodies. Women gave birth in the rows, returned to work within hours, and buried their infants in shallow graves marked only by memory. To the Bellamys, this was efficiency. To everyone else, it was horror turned routine. But even within horror, there are hierarchies, layers of cruelty. Some enslaved people were treated as property to pick and carry, others as tools to breed. This was the unspoken industry of the South, not just the harvesting of cotton, but the creation of human labor. The richer planters learned that producing slaves was cheaper than buying them, and in the year 1843, this idea evolved into something darker, something the Bellamy estate would soon perfect. Each Sunday, the Bellamy family hosted gatherings for neighboring landowners. They arrived in horse-drawn carriages, women in lace gowns, men in wool suits. They dined on venison and drank bourbon while their enslaved cooks served them in silence. On the surface, these dinners were ordinary. Polite conversations about harvest yields, market prices, and local politics. But after the guests left, the real discussions began. Jonathan Bellamy would retreat to his study, a candlelit room lined with books on physiology, agriculture, and what he called the science of inheritance. He believed that just as one could breed stronger horses or more fertile cotton, so too could one breed stronger slaves. To him, this was progress, a way to build a legacy beyond wealth, to manipulate blood itself. His obsession was not born from greed alone. Those who knew him before the war said he had always been fascinated by control, the idea that a man could reshape nature if only he was ruthless enough to ignore morality. The Bible rested on his desk, but he quoted it like a weapon, twisting its verses to justify every cruelty. And then there was his wife, Margaret Bellamy, a woman of quiet beauty and eerie calm. To the community, she was a model of Southern grace, generous with charity, gentle with her words. Yet, those who worked within the house claimed she moved like someone under a spell, her eyes empty, her hands trembling when she passed the nursery doors. What happened inside the Bellamy mansion was not spoken of in town. The enslaved who tried to speak vanished without a trace. By 1843, strange rumors began to drift beyond the estate. Travelers reported seeing carriages arrive at night, carrying no guests, only chained men and women. The fields near the northern barn were suddenly fenced off, guarded day and night, and when the wind blew just right, neighbors swore they could hear muffled cries, not from the workers, but from within the house itself. Still, the South was good at silence. Money silenced gossip, fear silenced truth, and religion silenced guilt. The Bellamy estate prospered, its cotton exports doubling within 2 years. The master of the house became a name of respect in the legislature and a whisper of terror among his slaves. But beneath that white-painted mansion, beneath the magnolia trees and marble pillars, something unnatural was beginning to take root, a practice so vile that even those who profited from human suffering refused to speak of it. The Cotton Kingdom was more than an empire. It was an illusion, one built on generations of denial and blood. And within that illusion, Jonathan Bellamy was preparing to unveil his most ambitious project, the creation of life itself on his own terms. This is where our story begins. Not with a birth nor a death, but with an idea, a single thought in a man's mind that the world was his to redesign. They said Jonathan Bellamy was born under a blood moon, a child who never cried, and whose first word wasn't mother, but mine. Whether true or not, the myth suited him. By 1843, he was the most feared landowner in Claiborne County, a man whose silence carried more weight than the governor's voice. He moved through his mansion like a spectre, his footsteps deliberate, his presence cold. Those who worked under him described his eyes as pale and vacant, like glass marbles that saw without feeling. He rarely raised his voice, but when he did, it wasn't anger. It was calculation, like an artist dissatisfied with the shade of red on his canvas. Jonathan Bellamy was not the kind of man who lost control. Control was his religion. He controlled his land, his family, his slaves, and most dangerously his own sense of morality. By day, he was the perfect Southern gentleman, polite, well-dressed, and fluent in charm. He attended church, sat in the front pew, and donated generously to sermons about sin and redemption. He quoted scripture with the ease of a preacher, twisting holy words into tools of ownership. The Lord, he'd say, divides man by purpose, some to lead, some to serve. We simply obey his design, but at night his sermons changed. He believed that God's design could be improved. Inside his study, beneath a painting of the crucifixion, were notebooks filled with his private theories. He called them Notes on Hereditary Perfection. In them, he recorded every physical measurement of his enslaved men and women: height, muscle width, bone density, number of offspring. His handwriting was immaculate, his logic monstrous. To him, they weren't people. They were variables in a grand experiment. The Bellamy slaves had learned early that the master's interest was worse than his anger. When he visited the fields, no one looked up. When he spoke, they kept their heads bowed. But he still watched them, their movements, their pairings, their strength under the sun. He saw in them not suffering, but patterns, and he began to believe he could manipulate those patterns. The first trial, as he called it, began quietly. He ordered certain men and women to be isolated in separate cabins, kept under surveillance, fed special diets. He told the overseers they were being prepared for selective breeding. The term passed through the estate like poison. At the start, even the overseers, hardened men accustomed to cruelty, were unsettled. But fear of losing their wages kept their mouths shut. Jonathan paid them in gold, and the gold silenced their conscience. Margaret Bellamy, his wife, knew of her husband's obsessions but pretended not to. She was not blind, only complicit. She had married into power and discovered too late that power came with rot. Yet even she couldn't foresee how far Jonathan would go. He began inviting physicians from New Orleans, men with European degrees and dead eyes. They stayed for weeks in guest rooms, walking the grounds at night, taking notes by candlelight. To the neighbors, they were visiting scholars. To those who worked the land, they were executioners in disguise. Jonathan believed he could breed out weakness. He saw blackness as labor, whiteness as authority, and thought merging them could produce a superior worker. His delusion was dressed as science, a fantasy that justified horror. Every night, he'd stand on the balcony overlooking his fields, the moonlight painting his face silver. The wind carried the scent of magnolia and sweat. From there he could see the cabins, the fences, the outlines of human beings moving like shadows among the rows. He thought of them not as souls, but as seeds. He wrote in his journal, "God made man from dust. I shall remake him from design. It was this sentence that revealed the depth of his madness. The Bellamy sons, Thomas and Edward, were too young to understand then. They idolized their father, learning early to mimic his coldness. He taught them that mercy was weakness, and that love was a distraction from destiny. When their mother tried to soften them, Jonathan intervened. "A Bellamy does not feel," he told them. "He decides." The household began to decay from within. Servants quit mysteriously, guests stopped visiting, and even the church stopped calling. Yet Jonathan thrived in isolation. His ambition no longer sought approval. It sought immortality. The local rumor mill turned restless. Townsfolk spoke of lights glowing in the barns past midnight, of screams that vanished with the morning fog. But no one dared to confront him. The sheriff owed him money. The pastor owed him land. And the town owed him cotton. Jonathan Bellamy owned them all, in coin, in fear, in silence. Still, something shifted that summer. One of the enslaved women taken for special use died under suspicious circumstances. Her name was Elise, and though no one dared speak it aloud, her absence haunted the others. Some said her ghost wandered the northern fields, carrying a child that never drew breath. Jonathan dismissed it as superstition, but his wife began locking her doors at night. The servant said she could be heard weeping behind them, whispering prayers that never reached heaven. The plantation seemed untouched on the surface. White walls gleaming, cotton blooming. But beneath it all, rot was spreading. The master of shadows had built his empire on bones, and soon those bones would demand remembrance. Because the deeper a man buries sin, the louder it calls from the dark. In the grand parlor of the Bellamy mansion, the light never reached every corner. The tall windows were veiled by heavy drapes, trapping the scent of candle wax, perfume, and something faintly metallic, a smell that lingered no matter how often the maids scrubbed the floors. Here sat Margaret Bellamy, the mistress of the house, poised like a statue carved from grief. She had once been the envy of every woman in Claiborne County. The perfect southern wife, porcelain skin, emerald eyes, and a composure that never cracked. But perfection in that house was not a blessing, it was survival. Margaret had married Jonathan at 17, dazzled by his wealth and confidence. To her, he was a visionary, a man who spoke of destiny and empire when others only cared for crops. But within a year, the charm faded. His conversations turned into commands, his affection into possession. And the mansion became less a home, more a cage with velvet walls. She learned early that resistance only made him colder. Silence became her weapon, the only form of defiance he could not control. By 1843, silence was all that remained between them. Jonathan spent his nights in his study, and Margaret spent hers wandering the halls, haunted by echoes. She had stopped attending church, stopped writing letters, stopped smiling. Her reflection in the mirror no longer looked human, more a ghost wearing silk. But beneath the numbness, something inside her still burned. Shame. Because she knew what her husband was doing. The first time she found out, she didn't believe it. A whisper from a house servant, a story of the experiments being conducted in the northern barn. She confronted him that night, trembling with disgust. "What are you doing to them, Jonathan?" she asked. He didn't look up from his desk. "Improving them," he said simply. "They're people," she whispered. "Their property," he corrected, his tone calm, his pen never pausing. "Would you question a man for breeding horses? Would you curse God for designing difference?" She stepped closer. "You're not God." He looked at her then, really looked. "No," he said. "I'm better. I learn from him." That was the night she realized she would never win, but Jonathan was clever. He saw her disgust, and instead of silencing it, he turned it into complicity. He told her that their family's future depended on his work, that other plantations would soon do the same, that their name would live in history books. He promised that when perfection was achieved, they'd be the first family blessed with purity and strength untainted by weakness. And then, he gave her a role in his creation. He asked her to choose. Each month, she was to select which of the enslaved women would be paired next, chosen for breeding potential. He made it sound administrative, scientific, detached. But Margaret knew exactly what it meant. Her hands would decide fates she could not bear to imagine. At first she refused. She wept, screamed, begged him to stop. But Jonathan's patience was infinite, his persuasion slow and methodical. He whispered about loyalty, divine purpose, and the duty of a wife. He used scripture as a cage and love as a chain. And so, one evening, under candlelight, she nodded. Not out of belief, but exhaustion. That was the pact. From that night on, Margaret became the silent partner in her husband's sins. She selected names from lists she didn't read, signed documents she didn't understand, and pretended the cries from the barns were the wind. Every choice she made carved a deeper wound into her conscience, yet she smiled at dinner, poured wine for guests, and laughed on cue. To the outside world, the Bellamys were the picture of grace. Inside their home, they were architects of damnation, but the human soul, even when buried, fights for breath. Margaret began keeping a small journal hidden beneath the floorboards of her vanity. In it, she wrote fragments, not confessions, not prayers, but questions. How far can a wife follow before she becomes the monster too? If I turn away, does that make me innocent? When God is silent, who forgives? Each page was a whisper against the storm, a plea to a heaven that never answered. By summer, her health began to falter. She suffered fainting spells and nightmares that left her screaming. She dreamed of faceless children crawling through the halls, their eyes full of hatred. The housemaid said she talked in her sleep, repeating the same words over and over. Make it stop. Jonathan noticed her decline, but not out of concern. To him, her despair was proof that his work had meaning, that even the purest soul could not resist the gravity of creation. He told her so one evening at supper, while the house burned with candlelight. You see, Margaret, he said softly, you suffer because you feel. That is your weakness. But our children will not suffer. They will understand purpose without emotion. She stared at him, her spoon trembling in her hand. You mean they'll be like you? He smiled faintly. Exactly. After that, she never sat at his table again. The servants said that some nights she could be seen standing in the gardens, barefoot, staring toward the northern barn, that her white nightgown looked like a ghost drifting among the magnolias. She would stand there until dawn, waiting for the screams to end, but the screams never ended. They simply became part of the wind. And deep inside her, guilt began to grow. Something dark and alive, twisting with every breath. Because she had made a choice, and choices once made cannot be undone. What neither she nor Jonathan knew then was that their pact would soon bear fruit, not the kind that could be hidden, nor the kind heaven could forgive. The Bellamy mansion was built to impress men, not to raise children. Its walls were too thick for laughter to pass through, its hallways too cold for warmth to linger. Yet within those halls grew two sons, Thomas and Edward, heirs to the Bellamy legacy, or what their father called the continuation of perfection. Thomas, the elder by 3 years, was quiet, calculating, and observant, a mirror of his father's intellect. Edward was the opposite, impulsive, emotional, drawn to light. He loved music, sketching, and sneaking into the servants' quarters to listen to songs sung in a language he didn't understand. In another world, he might have become an artist. But in the Bellamy world, sensitivity was a sin. Their father began shaping them young. At 6, Thomas was given a whip. At 7, Edward was made to watch a punishment in the fields. They were taught not to cry, not to question, not to feel. A man's worth, Jonathan told them, is measured by how little of the world touches him. By the time they reached adolescence, both boys understood their place: to obey, to inherit, to rule. But beneath their obedience, something else was forming: resentment. Margaret tried in her quiet way to protect them. She told them bedtime stories of saints and redemption, whispered prayers in the dark, but her efforts were drowning in their father's teachings. Every morning began with discipline. Every night ended with doctrine. They were being forged into instruments of purpose, and the fire was their father's will. One evening, when Thomas was 16 and Edward 13, Jonathan called them to his study. The boys entered nervously, for their father's summons never came without reason. The room smelled of brandy and candle smoke, the air heavy with authority. Jonathan stood beside his desk, a leather-bound ledger open before him. "Do you know what makes a dynasty endure?" he asked. Thomas hesitated. "Land?" "Blood," his father corrected. "Land can be lost, wealth can be stolen, but blood endures. The right blood, guided by reason, can outlast empires." He closed the book and turned to them, his pale eyes reflecting the candlelight. "You are Bellamy's. Your duty is not to live, and it is to continue." Edward swallowed hard. "Continue what, father?" Jonathan smiled thinly. "Perfection." That night was the beginning of their initiation, a series of lessons that blurred the line between inheritance and indoctrination. He showed them his journals, his diagrams, his so-called science of legacy. He spoke of bloodlines, purity, and destiny as if lecturing scholars instead of sons. But what unsettled them most were the pages filled with names, lists of enslaved men and women categorized by numbers, height, and fertility. The boys didn't fully understand at first. Then one evening they heard the screams from the northern barn. Edward covered his ears. Thomas didn't move. "Don't listen," their father said calmly. "Listen and you learn to pity. Pity is weakness. You are not here to pity, you are here to rule." From that night, Edward changed. He grew quieter, withdrawn, his sketches darker. Thomas, meanwhile, leaned closer to their father's world, desperate for approval. He began helping in the ledgers, recording figures, learning the trade of cruelty disguised as order. Margaret noticed the transformation, and it broke her. Her sons were slipping from her grasp, molded by the same hands that had once molded her. She tried to intervene, pleading with Jonathan to stop. "They're children," she said. "You're turning them into monsters." He looked at her with detached pity. "No, my dear. I'm saving them from weakness. You mistake mercy for virtue. Mercy ruins dynasties." When she tried to take the boys away to visit her sister in Natchez, Jonathan forbade it. "The Bellamy sons don't leave Bellamy land," he said. "Their blood belongs here." The house grew darker after that. Edward began to rebel in quiet ways, sneaking food to the enslaved children, leaving candles in the cabins at night. Small acts of kindness that, if discovered, could have meant death. Thomas warned him constantly, torn between fear of their father and love for his brother. "If he finds out," Thomas whispered, "he'll make you part of his lessons." But Edward couldn't stop. He was haunted by the screams, by the sight of human beings treated as numbers. Sometimes, late at night, he'd hear his mother praying, and he'd pray too. Not for forgiveness, but for an ending. Jonathan noticed his son's restlessness. And like every scientist, when he saw imperfection, he sought to correct it. "You have your mother's softness," he told Edward one evening. "It's in your eyes, in your voice. We must burn it out before it spreads." From that day forward, Edward's freedom vanished. He was kept close, given tasks meant to desensitize him, assisting in the barns, watching, learning, unlearning humanity. Thomas was told to supervise, to report any defiance. The brothers grew apart, not out of hatred, but fear. Each night Margaret wept alone, her journal filling with apologies she could never deliver. "Forgive me," she wrote. "I let him make you what I could not stop." By winter, the transformation was complete. The Bellamy sons were no longer boys. They were heirs, shaped by cruelty, baptized in silence. But what Jonathan failed to see was that inheritance carries more than obedience. It carries rebellion too. Seeds of guilt and compassion had already taken root, hidden beneath the discipline he prized so much. And one day, those seeds would grow into the ruin of everything he'd built. For now, though, the Bellamy name was secure. The master's sons had accepted their role in the kingdom of shadows, unaware that soon they would be forced to take part in its darkest creation. The barn stood on the northern edge of the Bellamy estate, far from the house, yet close enough for its echoes to reach the walls on quiet nights. To outsiders, it looked like any other outbuilding, weathered wood, a roof patched by years of southern storms, and a faint smell of hay drifting through the fields. But to those who lived on the land, it was a place of dread. They called it the Red Barn, not for its paint, but for what stained its floors. Jonathan Bellamy called it his laboratory. It was here that his obsession shed its disguise of civility. Here where the ledgers met flesh, the idea of improvement had become fixation, and fixation had become ritual. He spoke of breeding as others spoke of harvest, a cycle of control and yield. The people enslaved under his rule were not families in his eyes. They were projects, variables, instruments of legacy. At first, the barn's purpose was hidden from his sons. Thomas had seen the ledgers but not the acts. Edward only knew the screams that rose after sunset. But one rain-heavy evening, Jonathan summoned them both to the threshold. "Tonight," he said, "you will witness what sustains this land." The wind carried the scent of iron. Rain and rot mingled into something metallic and thick. Inside, lanterns cast trembling light over wooden stalls lined like prison cells. Chains clinked faintly as the captives shifted in fear. Margaret had begged him not to bring the boys. He told her coldly that a man who inherits must face the truth that feeds him. Thomas stood still, forcing himself to appear strong. Edward trembled, his hands locked behind his back. Jonathan led them down the narrow aisle, explaining as if giving a lecture. "Strong men, healthy women. I pair them. Nature follows design. A master's responsibility is to refine what nature wastes." He stopped beside one of the stools. Inside knelt a woman no older than 20, her wrists bound. Her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes were dry, the kind of emptiness that comes after too many nights of screaming. Edward looked away. Jonathan noticed. "Weakness," he said. "Look at her. She carries potential, blood that will serve your name." Edward forced himself to look, not out of obedience, but because he was too afraid not to. The woman's gaze met his for a brief second. Something passed between them. A silent plea, a wordless curse. It would haunt him for years. In the far corner, Thomas saw a table stacked with notebooks, small vials and quills. His father had recorded everything. Measurements, outcomes, dates of conception, names reduced to numbers. It was all so methodical, so precise. "Why?" Thomas finally asked. His voice barely broke the stillness. Jonathan smiled faintly. "Because progress demands sacrifice. History remembers men who shape the world, not those who question how it's shaped." He turned to his sons, his voice now cold, almost reverent. "You will inherit not just this land, but the purpose behind it. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded, silent and pale. Edward said nothing. Outside, thunder rolled over the fields. Inside, the candles wavered. The storm's light flashed through the cracks of the wood, illuminating faces, frightened, broken, waiting. That night, Edward couldn't sleep. He could still hear the sounds from the barn, muffled sobs, boots on wood, his father's voice echoing commands. Margaret found him awake near dawn, staring at the rain-streaked window. She touched his shoulder. "He's teaching you to forget what it means to be human," she whispered. "Promise me you won't." Edward turned to her, eyes wide and hollow. "How can I not when he makes us watch?" She didn't answer. She simply held him until the morning light broke, pale and unforgiving. Meanwhile, Thomas grew quieter, not indifferent but conflicted. He buried his revulsion beneath duty, convincing himself that obedience was survival. He began helping in the barn, recording notes, moving supplies, pretending not to see the cruelty unfolding around him. Each act of compliance built another wall between who he was and who he was becoming. Jonathan watched both his sons closely. To him, they were experiments too, two different results from the same design. He told Margaret once almost proudly, "Thomas will lead. Edward will either bend or break." Weeks turned into months. The barn's operations expanded. Jonathan spoke of perfect generations, of a self-sustaining lineage. He started assigning names to his subjects, not human names but codes and letters. He had turned the act of creation into arithmetic, but every equation hides its flaw. One night, while Thomas was cataloguing figures by lantern light, he heard movement in the shadows. A woman, one of the captives, had slipped her restraints. Her wrists bled as she tried to flee. Thomas froze. She looked at him, pleading, silent. For a heartbeat, he almost helped her. Then his father's voice rang from behind. "Thomas." The word was enough. She was caught, dragged back, punished before dawn, and Thomas never forgot her face. Edward saw less of the barn after that. His father kept him to the house, claiming his spirit needed discipline. But even from afar, Edward could hear the cries when the wind shifted east. He began writing letters to God, pages of guilt and despair he'd bury beneath the floorboards of his room. Margaret found one of them once. It read, "If hell exists, it must sound like home." By the end of that year, the barn had become more than a building. It was the heart of the Bellamy Empire, beating with cruelty disguised as science. Jonathan called it progress. The enslaved called it the place where mercy died. And within its walls, something else was forming, not just horror, but a slow, quiet rebellion. Whispers carried through the night among those chained and broken. They spoke of escape, of fire, of the day when the master's sons would inherit not wealth, but ruin. The seeds had been planted, and soon they would grow in blood. By the spring of 1844, the Bellamy mansion no longer felt alive. It breathed, yes, but only through sighs that drifted from the halls at night, through the whisper of silk dresses brushing across the floor, through the faint creak of doors that never seemed fully shut. The house had begun to remember. The barn's screams had seeped into its walls like smoke, staining every inch of polished mahogany and candle-lit corridor. Margaret Bellamy, once the unshakable matron of the estate, now moved through it as if walking in a dream she could not wake from. Her reflection in the mirrors seemed delayed, like it hesitated before mimicking her sorrow. At dinner, Jonathan spoke of harvests and progress. Margaret said nothing. Thomas watched his father with dutiful silence. Edward barely touched his food. The air between them was heavy, not with words, but with the weight of things none dared to say. One evening, as thunder rolled again over the delta, Margaret entered the parlor alone. The piano sat waiting. Her fingers touched the keys softly, playing a hymn she had learned as a child. The melody was fragile, something about forgiveness and divine mercy. But the sound faltered halfway, collapsing into silence. Her reflection in the piano's black surface seemed to whisper back, "Forgiveness for whom?" She turned sharply. The room was empty, yet she felt watched. The portraits of the Bellamy ancestors hung in judgment, oil eyes glinting in candlelight. Their painted faces seemed to shift as she stared, proud, cruel, eternal. She began hearing them at night, soft murmurs at the edge of her hearing. Sometimes she thought she heard children crying. Sometimes she thought she heard chains dragging across the cellar floor. Edward, too, had changed. He no longer slept in his bed, choosing instead the attic, where the rain masked the sounds that came from the barn. He'd taken to sketching by candlelight, faces, dozens of them, all blurred and frightened. One morning, Margaret found a drawing he'd hidden beneath a book. A woman's face, eyes wide in terror, and behind her, the faint outline of his father's silhouette. When she confronted him, he only said, "I can't forget her eyes." "Then draw something else," she begged. "I can't," he said softly. "Because they don't let me." The guilt was spreading like a fever. The house itself felt ill. The air damp, the smell of mildew and candle wax thick in the halls. Servants whispered the doors opened on their own. The enslaved refused to enter the western corridor after sundown. They said the cries of the barn now echoed beneath the floors, as if the earth itself was mourning. Jonathan dismissed it all as superstition. Yet even he began to show signs of unease. He spent long nights pacing the veranda, staring into the fog that rose from the fields. Once Thomas caught him muttering scripture under his breath, not as a sermon, but as a ward. "The sins of the father," he whispered, "shall visit the sons." Thomas didn't know if it was a prayer or a curse. Margaret found solace only in her garden. Among the magnolias and dying roses, she dug her hands into the dirt as though burying something she couldn't carry inside her. One morning she unearthed something small, a fragment of cloth, torn and stained, the corner of a dress she recognized. It was the same pattern she'd seen on a woman who'd vanished from the barn weeks before. She screamed until her voice broke. Jonathan came running. He saw the fabric and went pale, though he hid it well. "Enough," he said sharply. "This hysteria ends here." Margaret looked at him with hollow eyes. "You can't bury everything, Jonathan. Not God, not memory." He struck her. The sound echoed through the garden like a gunshot. That night, Edward packed a small satchel, sketches, letters, and a silver cross his mother had given him. He told her he was leaving. "I can't live in his shadow anymore," he said, but she stopped him. "If you leave, he wins," she whispered. "You carry the blood of the damned, Edward. You can't outrun it." "Then I'll drown it," he said. He never did. Before dawn, Jonathan found him by the riverbank, his clothes soaked, his face white with fever. He had tried to wade into the water but lost his courage halfway. Jonathan dragged him home like a disobedient child. The next morning a new sound came from the barn, hammering, steady and deliberate. Jonathan ordered the doors sealed. "No more experiments," he declared to Thomas. But there was no repentance in his tone, only exhaustion. He wanted to contain the consequences, not confront them. Still, the house remained restless. Footsteps echoed when no one walked. Doors slammed during prayer. Margaret swore she saw shadows crossing the upstairs landing. And late one night, Edward woke to find his father standing at the foot of his bed, staring, not at him, but at something only he could see. "Do you hear it?" Jonathan asked quietly. "Hear what?" "The crying." Edward did not answer, but after his father left, he did hear it, faint, rhythmic, coming from beneath the floorboards. In the morning, the enslaved refused to enter the main hall. One said the soil near the magnolia trees was rising, as if the ground was breathing. Another swore they saw a handprint pressed in the dirt near the barn's wall. Jonathan dismissed them all, yet his hands trembled as he lit his pipe. By autumn, the Bellamy estate was rotting from within. Not from neglect, but from guilt made tangible. The very air seemed heavier, slower. The mirrors had darkened. The piano stayed silent, and in every corner of the house, the ghosts of the barn whispered, waiting. Margaret began sleeping in the chapel room, clutching a Bible she no longer believed in. She prayed not for salvation, but for forgetfulness. But sin does not forget. It waits, and it was waiting now, in the trembling soil, in Edward's dreams. In the locked barn, whose doors began to creak open on windless nights, the Bellamy curse had begun to awaken. The storm came without warning, a wall of thunder and rain that tore across the Mississippi Delta like something vengeful. By nightfall, the wind howled through the cotton fields, bending trees until they snapped. The Bellamy mansion flickered with lantern light, its windows glowing like the eyes of a cornered beast. Jonathan Bellamy stood at the upper window, staring into the dark. The rain struck the glass so hard it sounded like gravel. In the distance, lightning split the sky, revealing the barn for a single blinding instant, its doors straining against the wind, as if something inside was trying to get out. Then came the knock, a heavy pounding at the great oak doors, half swallowed by the storm's roar. The servants hesitated. No one visited the Bellamy estate after sunset, and certainly not during a storm like this. Jonathan descended the stairs himself, candle trembling in his grip. When he opened the door, a figure stood there, soaked to the bone, hat low, clutching a Bible beneath his arm. "Evening, sir," the man said, voice low but steady. "Name's Reverend Isaiah Cole. My carriage broke down near the ridge. I was hoping to find shelter till dawn." Jonathan studied him. Tall, dark-coated, eyes too calm for a man caught in such weather. After a long pause, he stepped aside. "You'll find shelter here," he said, "but not comfort." The Reverend smiled faintly. "Comfort's not my aim, Mr. Bellamy, just refuge from the Lord's wrath outside." The door closed, sealing them both inside the storm's echo. Margaret met the stranger by the parlor fire. His clothes steamed as he warmed himself, the scent of rain and smoke filling the room. He thanked her for the hospitality with a quiet grace that unsettled her. Not because he was rude, but because his eyes seemed to see through everything. He spoke little over supper, listening instead. Jonathan asked the usual questions: where he was headed, what church he served, whether he'd heard of the Bellamys before. "I've heard of the land," the Reverend said. "Stories travel faster than wagons. Some say these fields grow more than cotton." Jonathan's fork stopped midair. "Gossip," he said flatly. "This land feeds families, nothing more." The Reverend nodded, unbothered. "And yet gossip often has roots. Even the devil started as a rumor." Edward looked up from his untouched plate, meeting the stranger's gaze. The Reverend held it, calm, probing. For a moment Edward thought he saw pity there. That night, as thunder cracked overhead, the Reverend requested a place to pray. Margaret led him to the small chapel at the back of the house, the same one she had taken refuge in during her nights of guilt. He knelt before the altar, hands clasped, but his prayer was not whispered. It was a murmur that grew louder, sharper, words not meant for comfort, but for exorcism. Margaret watched him from the doorway, heart pounding. "You pray like you know something's here," she said quietly. He turned, candlelight flickering across his face. "I pray like I've felt it before," he answered. "This house carries more than sorrow, ma'am. It carries hunger." She said nothing, but he could see the truth in her eyes, that she knew what he meant. Later that night, when the rain reached its loudest pitch, the Reverend heard something beneath the thunder, a faint, rhythmic sound coming from outside. He followed it down the hall, through the rear doors, and into the storm. The wind tore at his coat, mud clinging to his boots. The sound grew louder, chains swaying metal against wood. He reached the barn. Its doors rattled as though alive. For a moment, lightning illuminated the world, and he saw them, handprints smeared on the wood. Dark and wet, too fresh to be old. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. Behind him, Edward appeared, pale, drenched, eyes wide. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "Then tell me why I shouldn't," the Reverend replied. Edward hesitated. His lips trembled as if words were trapped in his throat. "Because it doesn't like strangers." "It?" Edward looked toward the barn. "What my father built. What he woke." A long silence followed. Rain hammered the roof. The Reverend stepped closer, resting a hand on the latch. "The truth doesn't stay buried, son," he said softly. "It only waits for someone brave enough to open the door." Edward flinched. "Don't." The latch snapped open. The wind forced the doors wide. Inside, lanterns still burned, faintly, impossibly. The air was heavy, rank with decay and iron. And in that dim light, the Reverend saw movement. Not figures, not living ones anyway, but ropes swaying as if touched by unseen hands. Crates overturned, the echo of breath where no one stood. "Christ preserve us," he murmured. Edward backed away, shaking. "It remembers him," he said. "It remembers everything." The Reverend closed the doors gently, crossing himself. "Your father's sin is not gone," he said. "It's taken form, and it's waiting for an end." Thunder rolled like cannon fire over the fields. When they returned to the mansion, Jonathan was waiting at the foot of the stairs, calm, but his eyes gleamed with something sharp. "Curiosity," he said slowly, "is a dangerous trait, Reverend." The preacher met his gaze. So is denial. They stood in silence, the storm raging behind them. Lightning lit their faces, one drenched in conviction, the other in guilt masquerading as pride. "Sleep well," Jonathan said finally, his tone like a blade. "You'll leave at dawn." But dawn would not come quietly, because as the storm began to fade, the Reverend woke to the sound of fire, faint at first, then roaring. The barn was burning, and through the smoke, he swore he saw shadows running, not away from the flames, but through them. He fell to his knees and whispered, "God forgive them. God forgive him." Inside the house, Jonathan stood by the window again, watching the fire's reflection in the glass. His face was calm, but his eyes were wet with something that looked like relief. The storm outside had ended, but inside the Bellamy estate, another one had only just begun. The fire began in silence. No screams, no warning, only the sudden bloom of orange light spilling across the wet, black fields of Mississippi. The barn burned first, then the stables, then the rows of cotton, the flames crawling across the land like living veins. By the time Jonathan Bellamy realized what was happening, the night was already lost. He burst onto the veranda barefoot, the wind tearing at his nightshirt, the air alive with sparks. The sky above the plantation glowed red, a false dawn rising over the ruins of his empire. He could smell the cotton smoldering, the sweet and bitter scent of ash mingling with something else. Freedom. Down in the fields, figures moved through the smoke, the enslaved, once faceless under his control, now illuminated by the fire's savage light. They moved not in chaos but in unity, silent, determined. The chains that had once bound them now glowed red in the dirt, and among them, leading the charge, was Samuel. The boy, no longer a boy, now stood tall, the very image of contradiction. His skin carried his father's blood and his mother's suffering. His eyes were Jonathan's color, but his soul was not. The others followed him, not because of lineage, but because of vengeance. He held a torch in one hand, a rusted chain in the other. Jonathan saw him from the porch, frozen in disbelief. The child he had called an experiment now stood as the judge of his creation. "Samuel," Jonathan shouted over the crackling fire, "put it down. You don't know what you're doing." Samuel's reply was steady, calm. "I'm undoing what you did." Lightning flashed in the distance, framing them in white for a heartbeat, father and son, creator and consequence. The wind howled like a chorus of the dead. Behind Jonathan, Margaret appeared in the doorway, her face ghost-pale, her hair loose from sleep. She looked not at the fire but at her husband, and saw finally what he truly was. "Jonathan," she whispered, "it's over." He turned to her, eyes wild. "No, not yet. Not while there's one seed left to burn." He pushed past her and descended the steps. The fire roared louder as he neared the fields, the heat lashing at his skin. The enslaved parted as he walked, not in fear, but in silent contempt. He stopped before Samuel. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Jonathan said softly, "You think you're free because you've burned the barn. The earth still remembers me. You are what I made you." Samuel looked at him. No hatred, just cold clarity. "Then you made your own end." He dropped the torch. It hit the ground, igniting the spilled oil that snaked through the fields. In seconds, the world turned to fire. The cotton rows became rivers of flame, the barn collapsed into embers, and the plantation screamed, 1,000 ghosts released at once. Margaret watched from the veranda, tears burning her face. The flames reflected in her eyes looked almost like absolution. She turned toward the house's open doors and whispered to no one, "Let it all end." Thomas ran from the stables, coughing, dragging Edward by the arm. "The house is next," he shouted. "We have to go!" Edward stopped, staring at the chaos. The servants running, the trees burning, the night sky devouring itself. "He brought this," Edward said hoarsely. "He summoned it." Thomas grabbed him harder. "Then let's not die with him." But Jonathan would not flee. He stood in the center of the burning field, arms raised, the fire haloing him like a mad prophet. "You think this will erase me?" he shouted into the night. "Fire cannot cleanse what was chosen by God." A voice answered from the smoke, not divine but human, strong and trembling. It was Margaret. "No, Jonathan," she called out. "God didn't choose you. You chose yourself." And with that, the house caught fire. Flames climbed the veranda posts, licked at the drapes, devoured the paintings of the Bellamy ancestors until their faces melted into darkness. The mansion's grand piano collapsed in a discordant scream. The air was thick with the smell of burning history. Inside, Edward dragged his mother toward the garden, shielding her from falling embers. "We can still make it," he cried, but she pulled away. "I can't, I won't leave him." "You have to," Edward begged. "He's already gone." She looked back at the inferno, her voice breaking. "So am I." She turned and disappeared into the smoke. Edward never saw her again. Outside, Samuel watched the fire consume everything, the fields, the barn, the house. He felt no triumph, only release. The heat stung his skin, but he did not move. For the first time in his life, the air smelled like something other than obedience. When dawn came, the storm had passed, and the Bellamy estate was nothing but ruin. The land smoldered quietly, the magnolia trees standing like witnesses draped in ash. The enslaved were gone, vanished into the horizon, leaving behind only footprints and freedom. Edward and Thomas survived, barely. Their father did not. Jonathan Bellamy's body was never found, only fragments of his ring and the charred handle of his cane. Some said the fire took him. Others whispered that he walked into the flames willingly, unable to live in a world he no longer ruled. As the sun rose, Edward stood alone amid the wreckage. He picked up a piece of scorched wood, carved with a single letter, B. He stared at it for a long time, then dropped it into the ashes. The Bellamy name had burned. But the blood would remain. The fire ended, but the silence that followed was worse. When the dawn finally broke over Mississippi, the Bellamy plantation lay in ruin, a skeleton of its former self. The mansion stood like a blackened monument, its columns cracked and weeping soot, its once white walls now carved with smoke and memory. The air still trembled with the echo of screams that had long since died out. What the flames did not take, the earth began to claim. The soil, once rich and red, turned soft and grey. Charred cotton stalks jutted out like bones from a grave, and beneath the magnolia trees, where the fire's reach had dimmed, the ground seemed to breathe, swollen with secrets, restless with what it had been forced to hold. No one knew how many died that night. Some said the enslaved fled into the swamps, vanishing without a trace. Others whispered that many had been trapped in the collapsing barns, their bodies swallowed by the same fire that freed them. And some, the oldest, the most fearful, claimed the magnolias themselves had taken root in human soil. For weeks after the blaze, the surviving sons, Edward and Thomas, moved like ghosts among the ruins. They said little to one another. Edward was thin and hollow-eyed, his voice dry as ash. Thomas, his arm still bandaged from the fire, spoke only when necessary. Both avoided the magnolia grove. They buried their mother behind the house, near the charred fountain. Her body was found kneeling in the great hall, her rosary fused to her fingers. They did not find their father, only a cane head. The silver B melted into an unrecognizable shape. The papers in Jackson called it a tragic accident. They printed Edward's carefully worded statement. A storm, a lightning strike, a spark in the barn. None mentioned the rebellion. None dared to, but the locals whispered. They always whispered. They spoke of shadows that moved across the fields at night, dark shapes that walked where no one should. They spoke of distant cries that rose and fell with the wind, like the sound of chains dragging across wet earth. Some swore they saw faces in the magnolia bark, faint, twisted impressions that appeared only in moonlight. And in the years that followed, those trees grew thicker, their roots pushing deeper into the soil. Their blossoms, once ivory white, turned faintly pink, a color the locals called ghost bloom. It was Samuel's blood, they said. It was Margaret's sorrow. It was the price of the land remembering. Edward tried to rebuild. For months, he brought in workers to clear the wreckage, to raise the house again. But none stayed long. The men said the ground was wrong, too soft, too cold. Their tools broke. Their horses refused to go near the grove. One night, Edward awoke to the sound of singing. It came from outside, low and distant, a hymn, old and cracked with grief. He walked to the window and saw nothing but fog. Yet when he stepped outside, he swore he heard footsteps moving between the magnolia trunks. He called out, "Who's there?" Only silence answered, heavy and patient. By morning, the footprints appeared, bare, small, and many. They circled the grove, pressed deep into the damp soil, then vanished into the mist beyond the fields. After that, Edward stopped trying to rebuild. He locked the remaining gates, boarded the windows, and wrote a final entry in his ledger. This land no longer belongs to the living. Then he left. The Bellamy estate was abandoned, left to rot beneath the magnolias. The walls caved in, the roof sank. and slowly nature began to erase the name that had once commanded the region. But not entirely. The land has always kept its record, not in ink, but in memory. Years passed. The war came and went. The state changed. New roads, new laws, new hands turned the soil, but the Bellamy property remained untouched. Even the bravest surveyors refused to map it. They said the air was too heavy there. The compasses spun wild near the grove. That at dusk, the ground hummed, like breath caught beneath the roots. In 1903, a farmer's child wandered too far and vanished. They searched for days before finding her shoes, neatly placed beside a magnolia trunk. The searchers said the tree smelled not of flowers, but of iron. In 1937, when developers tried again to clear the land, their machines broke down one after another. One of the workers claimed he dug up fragments of bone, small as bird skeletons. Another swore he found a chain, rusted and fused into the roots. By sundown, they all quit, and so the plantation became a ghost map, a place no one owned yet everyone feared. The magnolia grove stood untouched, its petals still blooming pink every spring. Local children dared each other to step inside after dark. Most returned pale and silent. Some said they saw figures standing between the trees, their faces soft and lightless, like wax melting in the moon. The elders warned them, "Don't look too long. The ground remembers your gaze." By the mid-20th century, the Bellamy story had dissolved into folklore. People spoke of the breeder of souls, of a cursed plantation where sin grew roots. Churches avoided naming it. Historians called it superstition. But when they dug through records, they always found gaps, missing pages, vanished registries, erased names, and yet every generation, someone would claim to hear the singing, a low, wordless hymn carried on the night air, rising from the magnolia grove, fading before it reached the road. The few who stayed to listen said it sounded like forgiveness. The rest said it sounded like a warning. Time did what it always does. It buried the evidence and polished the legend. By the time the 20th century turned, Mississippi had paved over its ghosts with highways and church bells. The cotton fields were gone, replaced by subdivisions and rusted tractors. Yet there were still places where the air felt older than the land itself, where the wind carried a hum, low and human. The Bellamy property was one of those places. Locals called it Magnolia Hollow. It wasn't marked on any official map, but everyone knew how to find it, by instinct, by rumor, or by the quiet pull of curiosity that only certain kinds of haunted ground possess. The magnolia trees still stood there, thick and twisted, their blossoms pink as old scars. They grew in a perfect ring, as if protecting something, or keeping something in. Most people didn't talk about the Bellamys anymore. Schools didn't teach their name. The courthouse kept no record of their deeds. The land had been declared unfit for cultivation, too acidic, too unstable. Developers avoided it. Historians overlooked it. It was as if the entire state had agreed, silently, to let it stay buried. But history never stays buried for long. In 1974, a university team arrived. Young, hopeful archaeologists funded by a Southern Heritage grant. They came to uncover the agricultural legacy of the Antebellum South. What they found was something else entirely. Their journals described shallow depressions beneath the magnolias, circular, uneven, packed with fragments of pottery and buttons. One entry, written in hurried pencil, said, "We hit bone at 3 feet, small, possibly juvenile." More than one. The project ended 2 weeks later. The site was sealed. The university denied the report existed. The lead archaeologist resigned that same year and refused interviews until her death. After that, Magnolia Hollow became a myth again. But a different kind of myth, one wrapped not in superstition, but in silence enforced by fear. Those who lived nearby said strange things still happened there. Machinery broke down without reason. Cameras failed. Birds refused to land. Hunters spoke of hearing soft weeping in the fog. A preacher once tried to hold a prayer service beneath the magnolias. He left halfway through shaking, his Bible soaked with blood from a sudden nosebleed, and then came the bloodlines. In the small towns around Jefferson County, families started to notice peculiarities in their ancestry records. Children with the Bellamy surname appearing in census archives long after the family was said to have vanished. DNA studies later hinted at a shared origin between several black and white families in the area. Distant cousins linked by a single 19th century lineage that no one wanted to claim. Some whispered that Jonathan Bellamy's experiment had not ended in the fire, that Samuel, the boy born in sin, had escaped the blaze, carrying both the curse and the proof of what his father had done. There were stories of a man who wandered the delta after 1843, skin pale as ash, eyes a grayish blue. He worked the docks, the fields, the swamps. They said he never aged, that he spoke to no one, but every spring he was seen near the magnolias, kneeling in the mud, as if counting the graves. No records confirm his existence, but every few decades someone claims to see him again, a pale figure standing among the trees, silent, still, watching. Modern documentarians came too, ghost hunters, history channels, amateur filmmakers. Their footage rarely captured much. Batteries drained, microphones hissed, and the wind always rose when they spoke the name Bellamy. But in one recording, recovered from an abandoned camcorder, a whisper is faintly audible under the static. It says, "We remember." The locals say the land isn't haunted by spirits, it's haunted by memory. By the things that were meant to be forgotten but weren't. Every blossom, every gust of wind carries part of that memory. Standing there today, Magnolia Hollow looks peaceful, almost beautiful. The sunlight filters through the leaves in soft gold ribbons. The air smells faintly sweet, but if you listen closely, beneath the hum of cicadas, there's another sound, a slow rhythm, like a heart still beating under the soil. It's the sound of what was buried and never forgiven. No sign stands to mark the place. No plaque tells the story, but the ground does. It tells it in its refusal to grow, in the way grass dies at the roots of the magnolias, in the way visitors feel a chill when they step between the trunks. Every few years, storms blow through the delta, uprooting trees and reshaping the landscape. But the magnolias remain. Their roots stretch deep, deeper than anyone realizes. Beneath them lies a network of bone and soil, intertwined so tightly that the land itself has become an unmarked cemetery. And maybe that's what Mississippi does best. Not erase history, but fold it into the ground until it becomes indistinguishable from the dirt that feeds it. When the wind moves through those trees at dusk, it carries fragments of voices. Not words, not songs, just fragments. A hum, a sigh, a half-remembered prayer. The same hymn the enslaved once sang in the fields. The same tune the fire could not silence, and if you stand there long enough, if you let the silence surround you, it feels almost alive, as if the land itself is watching, waiting for someone to finally speak its truth aloud. Because the story of the Bellamys isn't just about cruelty or power. It's about the cost of forgetting, the curse of silence that binds every generation that looks away. And in that silence, in the rustle of the magnolia leaves, the past still breathes, quietly, insistently, like a heart beneath the floorboards, waiting for someone brave enough to listen.